Born into post-war and post-democracy Poland, from an early age, Jerzy Popieluszko felt the weight of growing up in the shadow of the Iron Curtain in a Soviet satellite state. In 1966, at the age of 19, he was forced into military service, where he was met with threats, indoctrination, bullying, beatings, temptations. They tried anything they could do to break him, for in this young man was detected faith in something greater than the government. But he could not be shaken. In 1972, he was ordained a priest. Rather frail in stature and speech, they said Father Jerzy was a pastor who had the smell of the sheep. He devoted himself to ministering, to holding the torch for the believing, to being a support for the grieving and a source for the seeking. But as his faith was deepening, the regime was growing more oppressive. Any opposition to their rhetoric was meticulously muzzled, as was freedom of conscience and expression. The economy was strangled, schools and factories were shuttered. Freedom of worship was forsaken in favor of state-flavored atheism, and not a word of dissent could be uttered. They said communism was progress and the church was an obstacle to it. In 1981, an underground anti-authoritarian movement was created. They called it Solidarity. Its aim, peaceful civil resistance to the administration. A large contingent of this movement were religious, and when they gathered for Mass, they needed a chaplain. Jerzy was the only one to volunteer. He sacrificed his time, his safety, and his health to strengthen his congregation, to give them hope, channel their anger, and purify their hatred, to encourage them to not give in to fear. Soon, 20,000 plus would gather to hear his unauthorized words of redemption, love, and spirit. His messages were recorded and spread through all of Eastern Europe via clandestine cassette tapes. This, of course, made him even more of an enemy to the state. A state that was bent on controlling not only the actions, but the minds and character of the people. Thus, the entire Solidarity movement was declared illegal. The country was put under martial law, and any suspected to be involved were subject to searches, raids, and lockdowns. After sham trials and forged circumstance, thousands were forced into internment camps. Still, he persisted. The humble chaplain continued to champion the cause with conviction, despite his escalating exhaustion, fatigue, and sickness. The government deemed his sermons seances of hate. They called him the most dangerous man in Poland, dangerous for declaring the dignity of the individual, dangerous for asserting that God was sovereign, dangerous for revering Mother Mary over Mother Russia, dangerous for subverting the narrative. So they portrayed him as a terrorist. His message was never one of violence or revenge. They called his information misinformation because to their truth, he would not bend. There could be no minister of truth in a ministry of truth. So the crosshairs narrowed. Father Jerzy was constantly harassed in suffocating surveillance. He learned that the eye from Moscow never closes. They bugged his phone and tossed bombs through his apartment window. Random speeding cars would target him at crossroads. This persecution pervaded for months until finally, on an icy night in October 1984, as he was being driven toward a morning service, his car was forced to pull over. 3 shadowy figures converged on him with nightsticks. And by the time they finished, their cowardice had crafted from Jerzy an unrecognizable crimson caricature. His blood on their hands. With despicable rigor, they fettered his feet with stones and dropped him from a bridge into the Vistula River. 500,000 mourned at his funeral. But even more than his martyrdom, his refusal to submit galvanized his countrymen. His courage fortified them with strength and hope in what they could all do. They persisted. And though their exemplar was felled, a few years later, the Berlin Wall would fall too. For Poland, the long march to liberation ended when the leader of Solidarity was elected president in the country's first free election since before the Cold War. Today, pilgrimages are still made to the grave in Warsaw where Father Jerzy was laid to rest. At its foot, an eternal flame burns in remembrance and as a reminder that you can kill a man that speaks truth, but you can't kill the truth.